You fool! Warren is dead. The Halloween Experiment by Ian Gordon.
Overseer's Log, October 28th, 1976. Dr. Stephan Helm speaking. Despite several failures, I remain committed to Project Delusion. Thus, I present participant D, a retired professor by the name of Conrad Derrickson. Derrickson has lived a long and fruitful life. A life of scientific research pertaining to somnology, the study of sleep. Latterly, though, a crippling claustrophobia has robbed the man of his ability to work. Professor Derrickson, can you hear my voice? Yes. Please, if you will, describe the room in which you're sitting.
It's an illusion, I know it is, but I'm pleased to say that I'm enclosed by spacious white walls, giving one the impression of a vast, open space.
It isn't in the least profligate, Dr. Helm. I'm very grateful. Good. This is good. Now then, Professor, perhaps you could relate to me the circumstances surrounding your present predicament. Are you familiar with the hypnagogic state, Dr. Helm? Somewhat. Please elaborate.
I like to refer to it as the plane between consciousness and unconsciousness, a space in which one is neither fully awake nor fully asleep, a transitional state, if you will. After years dedicated to the study of sleep disorders, apnea, paralysis, and so forth, I began to see evidence in my investigations to suggest that such disorders were largely influenced by one's passage through the hypnagogic state. That is to say, that in certain studies, I observed that some individuals tended to linger longer than others in the transitional space. What was the reason for this, I pondered. Unable to identify the cause of this unusual tendency, I decided that I myself was likely the only guinea pig capable of providing the answers I sought. And so, last winter, I began a series of experiments with a singular objective: to achieve conscious awareness of, and therefore obtain boundless access to, the hypnagogic state. Yes, I realize the contradiction in terms, but this was an experiment beyond mere words, Doctor. I went through a number of phases in pursuit of my goal. The first was the drug phase, in which I experimented with a number of psychoactive agents, the usual suspects, LSD, DMT, you name it, and found that the mind-altering nature of the drugs in question only served to impede my attempts to access the required state. The second phase was one of meditation, spiritual, mantra, transcendental, all of which, just like the previous phase, proved ineffective. The third phase, obvious and overlooked in the first instance, was a bit of the old sleep deprivation. I found that in depriving myself of sleep for extended periods of time, I could, in small measures, alter my perception of the environment. To give you an example, at home, in the library, I could single out a book on the shelves and focus on it acutely until it changed color or disappeared entirely. Leather-bound tomes turned yellow before my eyes. Dusty paperbacks vanished into thin air. A terribly unhealthy way to attain a goal, but I felt it was worth it. But was I, in fact, attaining a goal? Were these illusions actually the product of me having attained boundless access to the hypnagogic state? Or were they merely the result of my body and mind crying out for help? Regardless, I continued with my experiment. I slept 2 to 3 hours a night, forced myself out of bed in the early hours, and paced about my library in a continual effort to stay awake. The strangeness began in early spring of this year. My commitment to the experiment had lapsed on a number of occasions. Duty called at the lab, and one needs an income if one is to continue to live and prosper. My colleagues and I were studying the unusual case of a small boy, an insomniac who, much to his mother's chagrin, slept only a couple of hours a night, spending most of his waking hours staring at pictures on the walls. I immediately felt a kinship with this boy. David was his name, 7 years old. Just as I had been able to do, David claimed that he had the ability, when he was, as he put it, very, very tired, to change things. And by this, he was referring specifically to the paintings hanging on the walls of his home. If he looked long enough at a portrait, he said, he could talk with its subject. If it were a landscape, he continued, he'd send the clouds in and make it rain. This doctor was all very fascinating to me. Formerly, I'd have said that the boy was hallucinating, very common in cases of insomnia, very common indeed. But having experienced it myself, I wasn't willing to believe it. Perhaps, I considered, hallucination was merely boundless access to the hypnagogic state. In any case, conversations with David spurred me on, and I was eager to get back to it. My first success took place on April the 2nd. I can't recall the time precisely, but it was after midnight, and I'd been awake for some 30 hours or so. My attention had been focused on a door, just an ordinary door separating the dining room and the library. Occupying the space I believed was the transitional, I somehow managed to convince myself that the door was no longer there. The handle had been the first thing to fade away, followed by the door and hinges, and finally, the frame. I reached out in quest of it, but found only a hollow-sounding partition, neatly wallpapered, like the door had never been there at all. This disturbed me, Doctor. Disturbed me because I was unable to reverse the process. I blinked and shook my head ferociously, paced around the room with my eyes closed, willed it to rematerialize. But still, the door refused to return from oblivion. Eventually, I settled down at the dining table and nodded off. When I awoke, the door was back in situ, but I felt incredibly groggy, tired in a way I'd never before experienced, almost as though a hidden part of my brain had been exercised for the very first time. Naturally, the experiment continued. Unlike the boy, David, I seemed to lack the imagination to converse with the occupants of portraits or to make clouds appear in the empty skies of landscapes. My abilities were limited to the alteration of a room's aesthetic, changing the colors of items, making doors and windows disappear. You've probably guessed what happened next, Doctor. I was sitting in the library, early May this was, manipulating the environment at will. I changed the colors of a dozen books, relegated a dozen more to the void, and had turned my attention to the doors either side of me, one leading back into the dining room, the other to the kitchen. I was rather lucid, I recall, and felt determined to get rid of those doors for some reason or other. At last, I achieved my goal, and found myself sitting in a room from which there was no exit. It was comforting at first. I felt untouchable, an invincible, eccentric professor who had managed to obtain boundless access to the hypnagogic state, locked away in a library out of time and space, enjoying his success privately. But before long, I became aware of a disconcerting lack of air, a closeness from which there was no relief. I grew hotter and hotter. My clothes clung to my skin, the sweat soaked them through. I gasped for air, my heart rate increased, and I began to doubt the reality of my situation. Was this the hypnagogic state I occupied, or was it merely a delusion born of sleep deprivation? Had I really achieved greatness, or had I, in fact, completely lost my marbles? The unreality of the situation robbed me of my faculties, I paced about like a madman, searching for the doors I'd so recklessly sent to Coventry like a pair of naughty children. But there were only books, row after row of strange volumes, books that didn't belong to me, that weren't a part of my collection, volumes conjured out of thin air to fill the voids that once belonged to navigable portals. I was a lunatic in a doorless cell. The heat was overwhelming. In the end, I must have collapsed, for when I awoke several hours later, I was lying on the cold parquet floor, shivering. Much to my relief, the library had returned to its normal state. I was very pleased to see both the door to the dining room and the door to the kitchen in their usual places. But I was stricken with a new fear: claustrophobia. I couldn't bear to be in that room another second. I fled through the kitchen into the yard, looking up at the grey sky of dawn, thankful for the sense of open space it was providing. And there it is, Doctor, my unusual experience. Suffice it to say that I have spent very little time in the library, or any other small confined space, since that terrifying evening in May.
Hypnagogic state or hallucination? Are the two one and the same? If you, Professor Derrickson, are unable to answer that question, then what makes you believe I might be qualified to? That's the reason I'm here, is it not? It is my belief that your inability to answer that question today is not due to a lack of knowledge, but owing to a reluctance on your part to accept the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter? Yes. Just look around you. What do you see?
I've already described my surroundings, Doctor.
Yes, and there's nothing to be afraid of in there, is there?
Wait. The door.
Where's the door? The door? I can't see it. I can't see it. Now, Professor Derrickson. Of course you can see it. Where is it? What are you doing to me? Oh, for the love of God. Participant D, deceased. I don't want to talk about it.
Thanks for listening today. Join us again tomorrow for part 5 of the Halloween experiment. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,